In 1993, the Urban Institute commissioned an experiment to determine racial bias in employers. The study took pairs of white and black men who applied for 576 randomly selected jobs from local newspapers in Chicago and Washington, D.C. When one of the applicants was offered the job, he immediately declined in order to allow the employer to offer the job to the applicant of the other race, and this was done equally on either side for both races. And the results were as follows. In Chicago, whites had a 19% chance of getting the job, while blacks only had a 14% chance. In Washington, D.C., whites had a 34% chance of getting the job, blacks had a 21% chance. You can also see the proportion of employers that gave the job offer to whites only, and the number who gave the job offer to blacks only, which didn't happen nearly as often, one-third as often. And this study has been replicated many times. This is a robust finding. This is not like a one-off thing. There was also a story that went around the internet of a woman who couldn't get a job for several months, but then changed her name and created a fake application on Monster.com and started applying for jobs as Bianca White. And of course, she went from months of no job offers to getting several phone calls the next day for jobs. Now, while I don't think that the particular experience of Bianca White, i.e. Yolanda Spivey, is typical, it is illustrative of how big of an impact this can be for some people. So there you go. This seems fairly open and shut. Employers systematically rejected perfectly qualified black employees for inferior white ones. Credentials were matched, right? References were matched. And the reason we know that employers are doing this, i.e. systematically rejecting perfectly qualified black employees for either inferior white ones or showing a bias for white employees even though they're not any better. The reason we know that employers are doing this is because when matched for credentials, employers usually, though not always, as we have seen, they usually pick the white applicant. And credentials equally predict competence for both blacks and whites. And credentials equally predict competence for blacks and whites. And credentials equally predict... Do credentials equally predict competence for blacks and whites? To spoil the ending, that's where this argument begins to break down. In 1993 and in 2003, the U.S. Department of Education commissioned the National Adult Literacy Surveys. In these surveys were performance tests that were given to 13,600 people in the U.S. aged 16 and over in 1993. These tests not only looked at the race of the test takers, but their school credential level. And there were 3 sections: prose, document reading and comprehension, and quantitative reasoning. For the document comprehension, we can see that whites outperform blacks at each credential level. In fact, you have to get down to whites who didn't even attempt college before blacks who have postgraduate credentials start outperforming them. Hispanics with postgraduate credentials begin to outperform whites on document comprehension only down at 2-year, but the Hispanics with postgraduate credentials only outperform whites with a 2-year degree by just 1 point. The gap is even bigger for quantitative performance. Blacks with postgraduate credentials only outperform whites with a high school diploma by 6 points and lag behind each white credential group beyond high school diploma. And Hispanics with postgraduate credentials score just 1 point below whites with 2-year degrees on quantitative performance. And there is, of course, a similar pattern with prose, and you can press pause or look at the links to if you want to see the numbers on those. Another thing to consider is the concept of an upper bound threshold. For example, let's say you had 2 job applicants. Both applicants put on their resumes that they could tie their shoes. Okay, so they can both tie their shoes. One applicant was white, one applicant was black. You can look at their application and go, oh, well, geez, they both have equal abilities because they can both tie their shoes, right? Because that's what you think. You think when you have, oh, well, here's a theoretical physicist, he can tie his shoes, and here's a guy with Down syndrome, and he can tie his shoes. Okay, so they can both tie their shoes. So, right, you see the problem with that. Now, who should the employer pick? Well, based on the fact that whites have higher levels of school credentials, and people with higher levels of school credentials tend to make better employees. And so it would be wise for the employer to pick the white person, even if all he knew was that both applicants could tie their shoes. The reason being that the ability to tie your shoe has a very low upper bound threshold. Being able to tie your shoes does not demonstrate any distinguishing cognitive ability or personal traits. So when an employer sees two applicants who have references and some schooling credential, well, how hard is it to get references and schooling credentials? Because all having those things will tell an employer is that the applicant has those things. It doesn't tell the employer about ability over and above that. And for this reason, statistically, it makes sense for the employer to discriminate in favor of the white applicant in the absence of any further information. Now, is this white privilege? Well, technically, but I don't think that's what most people think of when they hear or mean when they say privilege. Is it anti-black and anti-Hispanic discrimination on the part of the employers? Well, yes it is. But of course, when you say discrimination, well, in what context? Because blacks and Hispanics tend to have lower performance for any given credential level. So in the context of education level, yes, employers do and should discriminate against blacks and Hispanics for any given education credential. And pointing this fact out causes a great deal of whine among highly credentialed blacks and Hispanics who feel entitled to other people thinking that they're smart, right? When really, they're not much smarter than the average white guy who didn't go to college. And they're almost always not as smart as the white college dropout. Like, these people were pumped with a lot of silly ideas about the benefits of college by who told them that going to college is the greatest thing ever and that you'll be nothing if you don't go to college, right? Who was telling them that? Who was telling them this? Wait for it. Teachers, right? People who make a living in school, right? They make a living at the school telling other people to spend more time in school, right? And so they did this, they fell for this, and so they spend years and tens of thousands of dollars on a credential. And then they get mad at the world for not rewarding their dumb decision, thinking that they're more entitled to jobs than any other, than white people who are lower on the credential pole because they went to college. Well, guess what? Scientology is a very expensive thing to do, right? To go up the Scientology levels, to get to the various levels of clear, okay, you have to spend a lot of money to get through those Scientology levels. Okay, so people spend lots of years and lots of money moving up those levels, and guess what? The world doesn't care. Now, I don't think the university is quite that bad. Right? I don't think getting a super expensive social science degree is quite as bad as Scientology in degree, but it's the same kind of thing. What this comes down to is the people screaming bias thinking that they know what the proper criteria for employee evaluation is. For example, a popular political cartoon pumping this white privilege line points out that a white male with a criminal record is 5% more likely to get a job over people of other races without a criminal record. Okay, so who makes a better employee? The white person with a criminal record or a brown person without one? Well, that's an empirical question, but the white privilege pushers just assume the answer. Well, there's a lot of money in the social justice industry. There's a lot of money in big liberalism. Right now, I don't like the term liberalism, but when I say big liberalism, I think most people know what I mean. You know, TED Talks is a result of just the overflowing amount of money from big liberalism, right? There's a lot of companies, lawyers, people with a lot of money who have these liberal views. Okay, so there's a lot of money in big liberalism. So why don't you buy up all of this valuable, underpaid black and Hispanic labor and do something with it? Heck, let's say that you don't care one bit about blacks or Hispanics. Okay, let's just say all you care about is making money, and there's quite a few people like that. Why wouldn't you hire equally competent blacks, for example, for less money? Right? You could save 20% on wages because those blacks and Hispanics are desperate because they can't get any other jobs because all the other employers have such a high preference for whites. Why aren't there? I mean, this sounds like a great investment opportunity. In fact, companies do this kind of thing all the time by offshoring manufacturing into sweatshops into poor countries around the world, right? So clearly profits are more important than white only in this instance as they ship jobs, where a bunch of white unionized workers lose their high-paying jobs and they go off to India. Okay, so clearly, profits are more important than white only in this instance. But apparently, these companies aren't willing to do the same kind of thing domestically by paying certain groups in the United States, blacks and Hispanics, slightly less for the same jobs in the domestic economy. Right? So, let me try to rephrase it this way. If the theory of irrational anti-black and anti-Hispanic discrimination in the workplace is to be believed, then we are to imagine that, unlike in the international economy, where sweatshops are preponderant, domestically, in the United States, similar, often the exact same businesses, act completely differently and would rather pay white people more money than hire equally competent black and Hispanic people for less money. Right? And it just doesn't make sense, right? The reason that big liberalism doesn't put their money where their mouth is on this issue is the same reason that faith healers don't work in hospitals. They're wrong.